Pedagogy of Belgrade Surrealism, which is another way of saying that we're here to launch the new book, the new translation of the new children's book, The Five Feats, The Five Cockerels Gang, translated by Ainsley Morse and Aleksandar Bošković, published earlier this year. For those who have a Columbia ID, you can read the ebook for free on Clio. The book itself is rather
Horribly expensive.
and actually, on your computer screen, a lot of the artwork looks better than it does in the print book. Aleksandar Bošković is lecturer in Bosnian, Croatian and Serbian in the Slavic department. He has a special interest in the avant-garde, in avant-garde literature and experimental art practices. And one of his special interests is photomontage. A few years ago, he helped mount an exhibit of photomontage artwork connected with one of my Kosti's long poems. He's the author of Zenithism, a Yugoslav avant-garde anthology, which is forthcoming from Academic Studies Press. The latest, just delivered today, issue of the Harem Review has an excerpt from that publication with great artwork. It's worth looking at. Ainsley Morse teaches in the Russian department at Dartmouth College. She is one of the foremost translators of Soviet, post-Soviet, and contemporary Russian verse. And she also translates from Ukrainian and former Yugoslav literatures. She is the author of Wordplay, Experimental Poetry and Soviet Children's Literature, and a collection of theoretical essays by Yuri Tynyanov, formalist critic. One of my favorite books by Ainsley is a co-translation she did with Beloshevich, Sevilla Nekrasov's book. I forget the title.
I Live, I See.
I Live, I See, which was came out with Ugly Duckling Press. It's a nice fat volume, and it's really an entrance into another world. That translation should be. Okay, I will stop there. So I'll let you take it over, and then we'll have questions. And
thank you, Ron. Thank you, and thank you too.
Yeah, thank you. That's a nice introduction. Thank you for coming.
I wanted to add that I'm particularly grateful to Columbia and Harriman because Sasha and I found each other for this project because he attended a Zoom lecture about the Tynyanov book that I was part of. And then he wrote and he said, hey, do you ever translate from these other languages? And that was how it all started. So it's particularly fitting that we're doing our first official presentation of the book here. And of course, I am very grateful to Sasha for bringing this project. And it was a really fun endeavor for me and very eye-opening and exciting, and is leading to all kinds of further collaborations and projects. So we are going to tag team in this presentation. I will start by saying, okay, what is this book that we are about to tell you about? It is an annotated translation of a Marxist-Surrealist long narrative poem for children. Wait, yes. Do we do this? Front button or no? This button. Not this one. Oh, the red button?
Should be the right one.
We might have to just use our hand.
Okay.
Next, okay. So what is this book? Yes, I held it up and now you can look at the big screen. Original.
It's me. It works.
Oh, it was you. It likes you. Okay. By two poets, writers, Aleksandar Vučo. You better do it.
To the wrist.
Aleksandar Vučo is the other picture, I think, and Dušan Matić. And it was originally published in a newspaper in 1931. The title you can see there, it says it's a major daily called Politika. This is Politika za djecu, politics for children, so to speak. It was originally published there in 1931, and then it came out as a special art book edition in 1933. I think it's the next, yeah. And so you can see we have reproduced the cover of that edition on the cover of this. And what is inside this book is a reproduction of that 1933 edition. It's the bilingual text followed by a full facsimile of the original book, which is part of why it costs so much, apparently. Sorry. And the 1933 edition was a pretty substantial, has substantial differences from the original newspaper publication. The poem is all there, but it includes a programmatic preface, a foreword by Dušan Matić, a number of surrealist photo collages, and kind of experimental prose texts that accompany them, also by Matić. And the epilogue, which I'll read a bit later, was also added for this edition. So it's a pretty fleshed out and to some extent changed. So in this, in our presentation, we're going to give you some more of the fascinating context for this book and also read some excerpts from it. So that is the plan. And now I will let Sasha continue his capable clicking.
Clicking, yeah. Well, thank you again, and I'm also so honored to have a chance to work with Ainsley, who is amazing translator, not only from Russian, but also from ECS. And thank you for accepting this invitation. I think it was very fruitful collaboration. So I'll just say a few words about Belgrade Surrealism. We decided to go with the syntagm Belgrade Surrealism instead of Yugoslav Surrealism because there are surrealists in Croatia as well. And this group that was behind this work was mainly located in Belgrade, and they are in scholarship known as Belgrade Surrealists. So not to call them Serbian, but Belgrade Surrealists. And there is an interesting story about the group itself because it had several phases, and throughout their publications they would use photography and photo montage a lot. So, for example, this is one of the first journals that they published in the 1924 and 5, and the first issue already talks about the Manifesto of Surrealism that Dušan Matić wrote maybe a month or two after the manifesto came out in France. And in the same magazine, they produced images of tattoos, which was a thing at the time. However, this left one is interesting because those are not real tattoos, but actually the clothing that looks like tattoos. So it's also a fake sort of photo. One of their first photo illustrated books, surrealist books, came very early in 1926 by the poet Milan Dedijac. And already this book has a combination of prose and lyric inside. It's a very abstract kind of surrealist, dreamlike narrative about fight of day and night, something between dream and reality. And then it has this syncography, and it has also photo montage and photography inside, which, when you think about French surrealism, the first work with photography in French context came out in 1928, Nadia Breton's. So this is in a way earlier than that. And then they published this amazing, very beautifully designed almanac called Impossible in the 1930s. Even the typography inside looks very modern, with cursive letters, and both French and Serbian, Cyrillic and Latin letters are inside. Inside, there are also other works by our two heroes, Matić and Vučo, which are connected to the poetry illustrated with photomontage. This is one of them. Another one is by Vučo and Ristić. It's some sort of early paper movie or the screenplay or the film that was not meant to be done as a movie, but the main idea was to be this part of cinema by other means. Also has a lot of photomontages inside. And there are other collages that Marko Ristić made later on when he lived in France in the late 20s. But from very early days, they were friends of Breton before Surrealism came into being during the time when Breton was a part of Dadaists. So Ristić was, Marko Ristić, the founder of the movement, who was living in Lausanne in Switzerland, and he was reading Literatur, that magazine that Breton first started to publish in, and they established already a correspondence. So they knew each other, and these connections were very, very tight throughout the 20s and 30s. Matić and Vučo both finished school in France and came back in Belgrade. Matić was working in a high school. Vučo married, got kids, and some photographs of his kids are included in the book. And Matić in high school got many of his students inspired to join the Surrealist movement later on. And this is these are examples of their assemblages from the 1930s that are currently kept in Museum of Contemporary Art in Belgrade. But this middle one is very interesting because it has cut out paste text that is printed. It has even this Maljević's square, and the title is in a weird instrumental case. So yeah, and a few things about historical context. The book references, but in a very Aesopian way, what was happening in the politics at the time. There is a period of King Aleksandar dictatorship, namely in 1928, a member of the parliament of the Croatian party was killed. And then already in 1929, the king introduced dictatorship, so-called January 6th dictatorship. And changed the country's name from Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes into Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and tried to introduce some sort of new federation and kind of new administrative units that looked like this. It was an attempt to establish Yugoslavism as an identity versus, ethnic nationalisms. And already in 1931, there's that new constitution, but in that time, his attempts were recognized pretty much as oppressive. So there is this cover that is done by Ivana Tomljenović, a Bauhaus student that was a member of the Communist Party, and she referenced that political dire situation in Yugoslavia. At the same time, in very early January 10th, manifesto called The Position of Surrealism was published by 11 members, and already 10 days after it was banned. So the government or the Bureau of the Censorship was after them immediately. At the time, I would just mention that the Communist Party was banned since 1919, very early. And all the communists or the members of the Communist Party worked underground. There's something else I want to say. Yeah, and then what happened after the ban of this this little booklet and their manifesto was that you can read in the French magazine Surrealism in the Service of the Revolution, very emotionally charged text by René Cravel, who is writing about arrest of several surrealists. Oscar Davičo, he was organizing a Center for Marxist Research in Bihać in Bosnia, and he was arrested and sentenced for 5 years in prison. Đorđe Kostić was also arrested and sentenced for 3 years. Đorđe Jovanović and Koča Popović were also arrested, but Koča Popović was released, and Đorđe Jovanović spent a couple of months in the jail. Vučo, Matić, and Dedinac were all interrogated. They were not prison, but they were also part of the entire process. The main point is that there were two fractions of surrealism. One fraction was led by Dušan Matić, who was this high school teacher and who was more into producing literature that is geared towards changing rather than interpreting the reality, right? He was more prone to advocate option of real action, while Aleksandar Vučo was, let's say, more conservative, or he was into producing socialist literature. And these fractions were not big divisions, they were just opposite opinions within the group. But this book is a testament of possibility of their cooperation. And not to talk too much, I'll stop here. And maybe you can
What's
take
the next
over.
one?
Next one is
Yeah,
no.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, wait. Oh, a minute. So which one do you press?
This one, but you should
Go
direct-
over to
yeah,
the side.
yeah.
Okay. Ah, where did it go? It's gone. Oh,
it's there.
okay, it's there. Okay. So I'm gonna talk a little bit more about about this story, and I can start from something that Sasha just said when he was telling us about the these guys. Let's see, is it gonna work? No, it's not. Okay. I'm not gonna push my luck. Okay. Coach Popović, one of the surrealists who is arrested during this sweep, pops up in another work by Vučo about brave Kocha, and he even makes a brief guest appearance in this one. So you can see how even as I really I can attest to the fact that this is actually very effective children's literature. It's not just avant-gardists messing around and saying that they're writing for children, which is a lot of what happened in the Russian Soviet context. But here, it's very it really works as children's literature, and yet there are these references to the political situation, to their various groups woven in. So just to give you a sense of the structure of the book, it's the poem. I already mentioned that there is a foreword by Dušan Matić that I will return to in a minute. The poem is divided into 6 songs. We translated this as songs. It's called Pevanje. It would have been very possible to translate it as canto. So that was one of our translation questions that we waffled around, because it's certainly what the cantos are also called. But we decided to go with the English word song, also because it's that much lower of a register, kind of more appropriate to a children's context. So I'm going to show you the titles of the 6 songs. The first song, in which the main characters of this tale are described. The second song, in which Bulgy meets the lovely Mira, and the cockerels decide to save her from slavery. Third song, in which we see that Mira's rescue from the convent fails because of watermelons. Fourth song, in which is described the beginning and the end of a hot air balloon. Fifth song, in which is described Fifth song, in which we learn how the cockerels managed to hide Mira. Sixth song, in which we see ... And so just to give you a sense of the plot, because it actually has a plot and it's quite plot heavy, we have these 5 boys who are the cockerels of the title, the 5, a gang that call themselves the Five Cockerels Gang. And they are very much marked by their speech and other details as worker children, lower class workers' children. But each very unique and possessed of special characteristics and skills and so on. And so in the first song, we also find out that near the place the boys like to play in Belgrade is this interestingly shimmering convent or state institute for girls. So it's actually a very convenient and constantly wavering fusion of the state and religion, and it's like a very evil, bad place. where all of these unfortunate young women are imprisoned under the care of these incredibly sinister nuns. And the nuns are always nuns, even when we call it the State Institute, it's still run by nuns. And then sometimes it's called the convent. Kind of goes back and forth in that way. And so through various adventurous, rambunctious activities, the boys make contact with a particularly brave and adventurous girl who's stuck there in the convent institute, and they decide, as you see, to save her from slavery. And their first attempt to save her fails because, in part, as workers' children, these guys tend to be underfed and somewhat abused. And so one of the rescue party gets waylaid because he finds a larder filled with delicious food, and he is so captivated by it that he just sits there eating it and forgets to save the girl. And then a second solution, or a second method for saving Mira, is discovered in a kind of surrealist dream sequence that I will also talk a little bit more about in a moment. And this involves also a real world inspiration, because at the time in the newspapers, people were writing about the hot air balloon flight of Auguste Piccard in France. And so this is incorporated into the story. And the boys find this old guy who makes lampshades and convince him to put that aside and make them a hot air balloon. And I'm going to read you that part a little later. And so then they actually rescue her in a hot air balloon and fly off to a kind of magic island. They are hotly pursued by the most evil nun of all, but successfully defeat her and abandon all of the bourgeois adult world and have a kind of utopia on this island. And that's where we leave them. So that's sorry for the spoilers. I know before I talk a little bit more about surrealism for children, I just thought it would be appropriate to say a few words about the translation, in part because there are a couple of fun examples I can give you that relate even just to the plot. So in the first song, we're introduced one by one to these 5 boys who are the 5 cockerels. And each one gets a kind of a thumbnail portrait laying out who he is and what his background is like, and what hardships he has overcome. And they have these wonderful, for the most part, quite speaking names. And so we did decide that we should translate these names, partly because they are meaningful, but also because they are these lively, very active boys, and their names are often like in rhyming position, and they're kind of just popping up all over the place in the poem. And if they were potentially difficult to pronounce Serbian words with strange letter combinations, we thought that might stop up the reader, right? So the 5 boys, one of them is called Kraka, which is not that bad, but we call him Crocker. Njore, which probably would have been very hard for people to pronounce. And he becomes Nori, which is actually the name of a neighbor kid in my neighborhood. Jova is Johnny. And this is actually pretty much a straightforward. Jovan is like Ivan, Johnny, very fun. Bulja becomes Bulgy, which also corresponds to his character. He's the one who eats the watermelon. And Georgia Vodja becomes Captain Joe, which is also kind of a somewhat straightforward and also phonetically kind of matching sort of thing. The name of the most evil nun of all, Stara Sestra Kalavestra, we left, right? So she's Sister Kalavestra, because it sounds absolutely, it's like Maleficent or something. It sounds very, very sinister, and so it works. So that is just one example of some of the more conceptual work that went into the translation. Otherwise, it was wonderful to work with Sasha. I hadn't worked with Serbian in quite a while, so it was a good dive back in. And in general, I found that the language was not super archaic, like old-fashioned. We discussed this just a few minutes ago. Some of the slang, of course. I mean, there's quite a lot of slang, and it's like very place-specific Belgrade slang of the early 1930s or probably 1920s. And so some of that is stuff that people don't say anymore, but it wasn't like the dominant principle, I guess, in the text. And also something that we had to figure out what to deal with is that the boys, being like worker boys, speak in this kind of truncated, informal fashion that probably we could have done a more precise job of trying to replicate using, like, you know, New York, scrappy New York youth slang of the 1920s or something. But another principle that I at least had in mind very much while working on this was that this is such an exciting and fun poem. I want my kids to read this, right? And so I think we leaned a little bit more in the modern direction for reproducing this very lively dialogue, and threw in a few somewhat old-fashioned expressions as we went along. But I did want to mention that one of my main working methods in this project was reading it to my then 6-year-old, and I read her the entire thing. And she very much approved, and she like remembered the characters' names and asked what was going to happen next with so and was concerned about the fate of Bulgy, and she really liked Calabastra, you know. So I mean, like in the way that you like villains. So that seemed to me like a very good litmus test for dealing with the translation.
Something about
I'm going to talk a little bit. So in terms of this idea of surrealism for children, I just wanted to talk about this a bit because I have some background in studying Soviet children's literature. And so this was also a fascinating project for me in that there are parallels and then there are really stark and fascinating differences, right? So, I mean, the main difference, we're calling this talk the subversive pedagogy of Belgrade surrealism, right? So the elements of this text that are political and, you know, I called it Marxist, was something extremely subversive in its context, whereas of course in the Soviet context it becomes the mainstream, to put it mildly, right? It becomes like you have to write this way, right? And so this, I think, is really reflected at every level of the text. In one really interesting way that I will mention is that aesthetically speaking, there are not rules, right? So in the Soviet context, there are rules about what the ideology should be like, but especially by the early 1930s, there are rules about what can happen aesthetically speaking as well. Whereas for the Belgrade surrealists, the main thing that they had to keep in mind was like getting past censorship, in terms of how boldly or how baldly the political content is expressed. But other than that, aesthetically speaking, they could kind of do whatever they wanted. And I think this is part of what makes this a really dynamic and exciting book. You see it even at the level of experiments with language and rhyme and slang and stuff like that. So we talked a little bit about how this book maybe more resembles some of the experimental avant-garde work with a childlike aesthetic that happens in the pre-revolutionary period in Russia. Because there's this idea that we want to, there was this idea of kind of a general modernist idea about a childlike aesthetic opening up new perspectives for avant-garde and experimental art and writing. But it wasn't yet the idea that
we are using children's literature as a venue to create new people and so on. Where I think it is most explicit in this book is in the preface that we mentioned by Dušan Matić. This is a marvelous text where it is directed to children, but it is also very much a programmatic text about social relations. So you can see here at this point, it's a kind of an anti-fairy tale statement, which also parallels actually a lot of the discussions that were happening in the late 1920s in the Soviet Union. And there is also a very strong anti-grown-up anti-grown-up orientation, which is not something that you see as much in any Soviet context that I am aware of. But it's anti-grown-up and anti-bourgeois. And in fact, in terms of the actual poem, the only positive grown-up that we find in the whole poem is this old man lampshade who helps to make the hot air balloon. Oh, what is it? I think this is
the slide before you. Yeah.
Here we go. Okay. I just wanted to read this passage because I think that for me, this is the most compelling example of a very explicitly surrealist in the sense of Belgrade surrealist argument that is directed toward children. So this is from the preface. For the end of the preface, Matić writes, "Scissors draw. Books without pictures are boring," says Alice in Wonderland. "Books with pictures can at least be looked at. In Russia, all the children's books have pictures. When you've looked at the pictures 100 times and get tired of them, let the scissors out to graze on them. Scissors are quicker than a kangaroo. Snip off that fellow's mustache and paste it onto the stove. Cut off the little girl's legs and glue them to a door. Why should doors always be only open or closed? Let them take a walk. This is how you get a cut and paste picture, a picture opportunity, a picture feeling. This is how you take immobile picture tombs and turn them into a living picture, a life picture. This is how you bring together pictures parted forever and how you get the pictures you want, desire pictures." So this is very explicitly like, use art to make a new world, kids, right? Here we go, right? And basically he says that at the very end, in order to make a better order for people and for children, an order that would not be a tree-lined alley, a model, a bench, that would not be torture. What needs to happen is to scatter the existing pictures, alleys, models, benches, etc., in every direction, and that these pictures, alleys, models, benches, etc., humanely explode. This is very, it's pitched very carefully at this youth audience, but it's saying kind of what we all know, right? And I'm going to end this little part of my presentation by reading you what we're calling the epilogue. It doesn't really have a title. It's a final segment that ends the whole book by Aleksandar Vučo, but it was not included in the newspaper edition. So this was a further change to the book version. And basically, he's a little obscure here. But he's following up on basically the theses that Matić puts forth in the preface. So he writes, "On the stern and lengthy chain of the clever calendar, highlighted in red and black, every time on the same number, spring is bound to burst and bloom. Yet lately and ever more often, with winters that simply won't soften, we know that spring may sneak on past to trick the fruits and trees and grass, and quite in spite toward everyone, to turn her pink heels toward the breeze, and suddenly just cut and run." It's also about climate change. "We also know that people lie when they tell little kiddies why. The boss of heaven, who knows all, that's God. He's the best of the best. That's God. He is faster than fastest. Like a tiny piece of bread, he will hold you on his head,
And like a little piece of bread, in keeping with his measured will, he will fry you on his head. The boss of heaven, who knows all, will sort out your earthly lot, either wealth or poverty. In 1933, following the death of Jesus, knock out the hundreds and thousands, the thousands and hundreds. In the teeth of the sweet tale of God and his deeds wondrous, spring is just outright refusing to burst forth and bloom for the season. Most of the world these days harks to the croak of cash, where fields once bore fruit, now bars doughs smelling of ash. For most of the world now, the only ones with rights are scoundrels and parasites. The rest are merely grains of sand. No one pays them any mind. The wind scatters, so we wonder. So who's asking? Who asked you? The rest are merely there to hew. No one pays them any mind. The wind scatters, the poor slackers. Let them croak, let them stew. Who asked you? Who asked you?
She's only about a little part, but the rhymes are just wonderful.
Oh, thank
Here we had rights and parasites, and they're really, which you obviously need for a children's book, or this part of children.
Yeah, they have to, yeah, it has to work. Otherwise it's too long. You get bored listening. But the rhymes actually, you can listen for a while, I hope.
And that was actually discussion that we had a lot while working on this, to sacrifice the truthfulness to the text for the rhymes.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I have to say you're so talented to do this in English and to keep also the meaning present. And
Yeah, we didn't sacrifice.
we didn't sacrifice. True. Which is really an accomplishment. And yeah.
No, but it was definitely a priority for sure. And yeah, there's just some things where it has to be there. So we want to say a little bit more about collage, right? If we can keep you. I think, I did it. There you go. Huh?
Yeah.
Okay. Wait, just here, right?
So yeah, Vučo's brother Nikola Vučo lived for a short part of the late 20s in Paris, and he was the one doing photography mainly. So he made this photograph that was reproduced in the 1930s, the Impossible magazine. And it's interesting because in that magazine it was printed together with a quote, and the quote is that basically this is the wall of agnosticism, of irony and indifference that bourgeois society persistently constructs in defiance to the essential fire and real consciousness. Meaning that this is a metaphor of this like anxiety of the epoch, right? This mass-produced building block on the shore of the river Seine becomes much more right than just repetitive material, but it tells something about the very historical moment that they were talking about. And Matić takes, I would say, this into account when he is composing the covers. And this is actually, the visual metaphor of this wall of agnosticism. How it is built, I think it's very interesting because there is a lot of rhyme in it, right? There is a rhyme of these like spaces between the blocks with the bars. There is a rhyme of 5 images of the girl and the 5 boys. And there is also a storyboard. There's like a filmic quality to it because you can see here girl in robes that gets at the very end becomes free. And there is also a window, and I wanted to say a few words with this. So wall is one of the concepts of Belgrade Surrealists that they put forward and work with. Another one is the concept of marvelous, because at the same time you have here the linear chronotype the chronotype linear time and space, right? From the captivity to freedom in this sequence here. But you also have some sort of enchanted world that is enclosed in itself. And the photomontage itself in surrealist art is this form that has the capacity to reveal the marvelous as the property of the real. And that's why they recognize photomontage as this revolutionary means of representation. This is an illustration, some sort of how the marvelous is both present in reality, but reality sometimes can look as completely surreal world. And in his foreword, Matić also uses this murder that happened in Zagreb to talk about it. It's very, I would say, much darker than Vučo's verses, and it is as if written for older children as audience. Spacing and doubling is very important in both collage, but also in the book with this concept of the convent and the State Institute for the Girls, which obviously stands for this monarchical, right, kingdom in connection to the statehood and then sovereignty of the monarch. And I would also argue that this photo collage at the cover has in the image of a window, it has this concept of interval, something that Matić does to the poem. So one of the things that I think this book tells us about is how much the book as an art form differs from the poem published in the magazine. Because what Matić does with his photomontages, he kind of opens up the gaps in the narrative and fills them with a completely different content, which is photomontage and his explanations of the photomontages. So he kind of extends the fictional world that is given by the poet and makes some sort of.
Well, and it suggests, in the way it's just interpolated in the book, it happens in the middle of the various songs, and it suggests that the linearity of the narrative could also be interrupted at other points, right? Like, so it complements, right? I mean, each collage is called "What Happened in the Meantime," but it kind of expands time in this way, so that it could happen in the meantime at some other place as well.
Yeah, and when you look at these photo collages and read the explanations, you can actually have access to a completely different story that is, because of Matić's leaning towards revolutionary action, is much more in Aesopian language referencing what happened with his friends being in jail and being kind of persecuted for their political inclinations. So the book itself becomes this, it's a children's book, but actually it's much more, right? It tells a story that is connected to the very members of the Surrealist movement in Yugoslavia. And that's what makes it so interesting, even more so because, these photo collages are inserted in between pages 8 and 9, for example. And there are these explanations that will go along with them. And this is the last photo montage that tells and what
happens next.
What happens next in their lives. And here you can see like a 5-point star. And, the very image of the wall from the beginning is now a ruin. And the industrial site that leaks, that kind of lurks back is this image from the Ford plant that was to foreshadow the socialist industrialization after the Second World War, for example, with communists gaining the power. But having a 5-point star in the book at that time was pretty much risky, and it is a question: how did this pass the censorship? In the terms that communists were very much persecuted by the government at the time. And I don't know whether
we can read one, or I was just remembering, as you said, that these prose texts are, as a rule, both significantly more surrealist, absurdist, what you will, and also a lot darker than the text of the poem. I was remembering that one of them has this funny little rhyme in it that went over well with my test readers, but otherwise they were not that into the prose miniatures. But yeah, we were just to give you a taste of it. I thought we would read the text that goes along with this particular collage. I hope you can see the picture well enough that it is dominated by, that is supposed to be the face of Sestra Calavestra. And this is what happens after that first attempt to save Mira fails. So sodden with torrents of sorrow and despair, and with hearts aching, there they went, 5 boys, 5 age mates, 5 aces. Everything was falling on the 5 birds, also sodden with sorrow and despair, and even the blades of grass drooped their heads all over the area around the perfidious institute, which was dark as plague. Out of one of the windows, Mira's hand came falling, just her hand, all bloody, and helplessly greeted, or more like called for help from the 5 departing boys. Before the institute's door, half buried in the earth, a plucked and skinned little chick stood making sure that no one else came near. A legion of birds was flying all around this black house, and black grass was growing so that there could be no path through the space. For 9 days and 9 evenings, out in the forests and among the birds, moths, and bugs, Johnny was constantly busy with something, preoccupied, struggling like a cat with a can tied to its tail. And he was constantly reading and reading something. For 9 days and 9 nights, the face of Sister Calavestra, like a boiled pork shank, like a rotting blue eggplant, like an enormous gob of spittle, and like the stain beneath a dead cat, has been watching over this sodden place. The pork shank is pleased, the gob of spit and blue eggplant is pleased. The stain beneath the rotting cat is also glad that beneath itself it has kept one lamb from kidnapping and flight. So, you know, it packs a certain punch, but pretty significant divergence from the register and aesthetic of the rest of the poem.
I love the penultimate paragraph there, the face of sister.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, the rotting blue eggplant. And you can see, of course, that, I mean, as Sasha has already described to you, a lot of these basic aesthetic principles driving Belgrade surrealism are there to be seen in the collage as well. Let's see.
Could say a few words about what happened after, but unless you wanted to say something
About
else.
what happened
How the
after.
dream-
Yeah. Well, so I was thinking about reading you the song that comes right after this one. But we also have a kind of a we also have a sort of, what is it? Where are they now? Section, if you would like, to hear about that. I mean, we're at 4 o'clock. If I read you the song, it takes like probably about 10 minutes. Yeah, I think, okay. And this is the 4th song, in which is described the beginning and end of a hot air balloon. And I thought we would read it also because it has this an inserted sequence that is the surrealist dream sequence. So there's a reference in the prose text that I just read to this character Johnny, who is constantly reading and reading something, and you get to figure out where that goes in this song. So there's also some classic literary references. Since that fateful sodden night, when tragedy had brought about their complicated plans collapse, 10 nights and 1 more rainy day had passed. Over this time, all the cockerels suffered a most dreadful feeling, a wretched, heavy, aching head, and the vacant, profuse press of that fat-tailed, dark complaint, which everywhere is known as spleen. The spleen that makes you purse your lips like a sealed off deep sea clam, while your heart is aching still with an old sorrow, so it seemed. In that troubled atmosphere came the dawning of day 12. But the night before that day, a strange dream came to little Johnny. This is the dream. It's given in italics. He's looking at a yellow parlor. The parlor floor is growing grass. There's a cow wearing two hats. One hat is a black storm cloud. The other hat's a pure white flag. The cow is wearing two dish rags. Dish rag one's a pale grave digger. Dish rag two's a jockey blue. The cow is bearing two broad plates. From the first, the wild wind plays. From the second, like rainfall, all in tears cut out from paper, and some fabric soft as vapor, head over heels, our Mira falls. By these strange dreams most impressed, little Johnny could not rest. Far away from all the world, he went to stroll around the wood. When all at once beside a tree, underneath a dry old branch, he espied a fluttering page. And there for any eye to see, on a page from some old book, very recognizably, the Montgolfier brothers' air balloon. He seized the picture, eyes aflame, dashed off faster than an arrow, and prouder than a peacock stood before his band of cockerels, and with a wild shout he proclaimed, "Fellas, I found and found out. Wait until you hear. So happy I can barely breathe. I ran here like mad to tell you my report as quick as I could. Fellas, I found and found out a way that we can save our Mira. So now listen to my system. Anyone who doesn't get it, well, even a dumb elephant wouldn't sweat it. I'll lay the whole thing out up front. I know you've all got birdie brains and your plans are lousy stunts. Take the plugs out of your ears, lean in close to catch my tune. The only way to rescue Mira is with a grand hot air balloon." From a sense of manic gladness, all the cockerels felt a shiver. All their hair stood up on end like a fan that lightly quivers, while their throats were tight, held fast, since it was clear as day to them that in the quest for Mira's freedom, the crucial hour had struck at last. But then Nori found his voice and broke the silence loud and clear. "Okay, buddy, that sounds super, but we know we can't be sure. These balloons just can't be trusted. Not to make a big detour. As soon as it gets in high gear, it's just a small leap upside down, just like old Monsieur Picard, out into the stratosphere. Or it can, should it desire, plunge down fast into the deep. Then, poor Johnny, you'd be done for, just as Icarus fell far." I'm going to skip a little bit. This is the section where he goes to the old man lampshade. I'll say, let's see. This is what okay. Within an hour, he'll make a bell, umbrella, or grand bird. And when the light bulb's put in place and the lampshade newly made casts its glow across the floor, all his blood runs to his face, and fit to burst with pride and joy, while the rats gnaw at his coat, he nods his old gray head and gloats, just like that Madame Pompadour. One day, as if he'd suddenly dropped in through the old roof, in the ancient dwelling's basement, Johnny popped up like a sleuth. "Hey, old codger," cried out Johnny, "you're a real live force of nature. What do you want with these cages? This is hardly work for you. 'Cause inside you, I can sense it, there's enormous talent hidden. So instead of freezing here in your basement days on end and cutting up these pretty rags and saving up your pennies, make me a hot air balloon." Skipping a little bit further down. For the old man, it was nice to hear all of this fine advice. And at once, all in a flurry, as if awakened in a hurry, rosy as a morning bun, he stretched his fingers one by one, seized his pliers from the mantle, took up the lampshade on the table, and began to tear the silk to entirely dismantle that poor lampshade, his creation. After these harsh depredations, it looked like something dead and done. Then he took the wiry carcass and commenced to twist and squash it, to compress it. And at last, most dexterously, it was spun round and sharply splayed, so the form of the balloon rose up before him straight away. Now he had to tightly swathe the wire with fabric covered up, and so he dragged from beneath his bed a wad of filthy canvas cloth. Sorry, I'm going to keep on skipping ahead. Don't want to, it takes him a while to make the hot air balloon. And then I plan to skip this. There's a wonderful interlude along with one of these collages where Calavestra goes out on the balcony and sings a romance song, which is pretty epic. But I'll spare you because I would also have to sing. And it contains, it has like, we didn't mention this, but among the others, I guess, what would you call it, not stylistic, but intertextual components in this book are references to South Slavic folklore and older literature. That's all, it's all in here. Okay. So while from balcony, that song flew fresh and pretty, tra-la-loo. From the east, the chubby outline of the balloon came into view. Quiet as a plump carp fish or a toad amidst pond squish, the balloon went flying low and arrived at Mira's window. Then a quick, strong arm in haste seized up Mira by the waist, raised her lighter than a feather, and tossed into the basket's dark. And when after that once more the balloon began to rise, Calavestra, that old spy, dashed off in frenzy like a shark. She grabbed soap, a broom, small change, a scalding iron from the range, and as rancorous as a magpie, flung all of these objects high at the balloon with a wild cry. The balloon swiftly caught on fire. The smoke it marked, their eyes were dark, and they all felt things were quite dire. And while Inferno all around was gobbling the balloon like toast, who knows what might have become of this ardent band of cockerels if below in the wide field there hadn't popped up two tall posts. Askerland was witness to it. All the naysayers are rascals. That's Askerland is the pseudonym of Vučo. He saw the miracle take place. On the telegraph's long wires, our balloon hung, stuck in place. Then, as if just nestling down, like when some old marquee retires, it started rocking on its axle. Finally, a wire did snap and the balloon fell to earth. And from the murky wreckage came, smeared with ashes from the flames, the entire gang of cockerels crawled out into sun and air and stood tall and knew their worth.
Yeah, I think
We should have read some of the original too, but we'll spare you.
The next time.
Yeah.
No, so I have a couple of questions before I throw it at them. How did you, Sasha, get interested in this piece of work and of children's literature? And does the work have any currency today? I mean, is it reissued and?
Maybe you should show that slide.
yeah, that's a great question. So I was working on photo illustrated poems from the 1920s and 30s, and initially this was a piece that I wanted to write in my dissertation, but because I was lucky enough to get a job, I had to wrap it up quickly, so this was left out. And yeah, it's coming back to this project and having luck to have a great translator who in Ainsley who accepted to work on it. So that's how it started. And I have to say, in my childhood, I didn't know of it. I learned during my BA, like at university, I learned about it and I really liked it. And there's the story about its publication after the 1933 is very interesting, because only in 1959 it was published with forward photomontages and explanations, but in reduced and poor quality of format. While each other publication later would left out Matić's contribution to it and would just print the poem, and it was mainly školska literatura, like a school.
Excluding that final section that I read, which also kind of takes it in that more political direction.
But from what Ainsley read, I think, yeah, definitely it is a book that it's very much current these days, and I like your modern rendering in this translation. It sounds.
But I mean, do people still read it in like just the poem? Would they still read it in
I don't
school?
think it's in the school curriculum now. No.
But at home, maybe is this a book that you would buy for your nephew or something? That's what I guess I'm not.
I hope not, but
So he can grow up and be like Walter.
I have colleagues, older colleagues who are teaching at the universities who read this book as in childhood. Yeah. So it's a generational idea. Yeah.
But you can see just from the
image here. This is like the more of like the school edition, and it's printed together with another poem by Vučo featuring this Kocha, who we mentioned, who is both his colleague in politics and art, but also his character.
Kocha is this guy who ended up in Spanish Civil War and who was the right hand of Tito, and who after the war became the ambassador to the United Nations and one of the main guys to work on the non-alignment movement and foreign policy of Yugoslavia. Yeah,
But
those were
also
the they were real things.
The dreams and waking life.
Exactly,
of
yeah.
Kocha.
And it is interesting that, for example, Marko Ristić became the first ambassador to Paris, to France after the war. Vučo and Matić both worked at the film industry. Vučo as a director of the studios and Matić as a teacher in the film academia. And you can see two of them here in the center of this matinee, which features all the big Yugoslav poets, including Branko Ćopić, Radičević, Popa, Vučo and Matić, Crnjanski, Meša Selimović, Ivo Andrić, and the critic. It's Ivo Andrić 2 months before he would die.
Yeah, so and I mean you can imagine that this poem, at least, if not the full book, being part of the school reading, has to do with this post-war prominence of these figures.
Has it ever been translated into Russian?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. I think I looked it up. I don't think much by either of them exists.
Yeah. Matić also has an interesting. Aleksandar Vučo wrote only for children, mostly wrote for children, and he's one of the reformers of children's literature. While Dušan Matić had, after Second World War, interesting books of poetry that are more in surrealist vein and not for children, but he experimented with syntax and very, I think,
I just
successfully.
thought if we could translate. I have an idea.
Right, to run
Straight
straight
up.
up.
Into Russian, yeah. Знаю Ирину Анастасьевич, Корнелий Вичин, которая может быть.
Yeah.
Is the convent recognizably Orthodox?
No. Yeah.
No, it's kind of all-purpose Christian, I would say. That's my sense of it. Like, there's, I mean, the only detail, the Oche, actually, I told you that one of these prose miniatures went over well with my 6-year-old at the time, and it's because there's this weird little rhyme, which is kind of playing with the Our Father prayer. But it's like a complete parody. So it's like it's Oče našu tamburašu, chleb naš, right? So this, to the extent that the Our Father, but everybody has the Our Father, right? Exactly. So it's not.
There are no signs of religious signs, except there is a reference to in the text, in the prose text, not in the photomontage. There is a reference to cross. Just
To the
like
cross
that.
and to the vinegar.
Vinegar that Jesus was fed with.
But they're all really like universal Christian images.
And it is the very much the photomontage that references the torturing of fellow surrealists, because he mentions how these nuns are about to torture. They're threatening Mira with castor oil, which is a reference to Mussolini, how the black shirts tortured their opponents and people in fascist Italy. And it is something that this Ivana Tomljanović is photomontage of the dictatorship in Yugoslavia also references.
Also, but yeah, no, there's nothing more specific than that. And I don't know, I mean, it's kind of an interesting question, like whether maybe there was even an intention for it to cover the problem
of religion in all of Yugoslavia, right? Because you have more than just Orthodoxy.
One of the plans of King Aleksandar with the constitution was to get rid of Cyrillic letters, which didn't pass through. But I mean, it was such a radical dictatorship to null every sort of identity connected to the transcriptive. But the poem was printed in Roman letters in the original.
How strong a tradition is there of children's literature with this motif of a small group of boys? Let's say 5, roughly.
There is a lot of like gang or group of boys stories, but primarily after the Second World War.
So this is kind of a forerunner, right?
It is, yeah, in a way.
I mean,
But
sorry. It's very strong motif in Czech, but I think it's the most famous texts are written in the 40s during the war, and emerge, immediately after and become a major text. And there's just infinite sort of references and parodies of that later on.
Well, the critics also connected this type of narrative with Lewis Carroll's Snark, Hunting of Snark, which also it opens up with describing the heroes of the story. And Carroll was a big surrealist model to follow, yeah. And I think they were inspired by Aragon's translation into French by Carroll's
Carroll.
Hunting of Snark.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm really struck by this preface, which is essentially a surrealist manifesto for children. It's a sense to pronounce, but it also kind of got me that to some extent, I'm curious about on one hand, this is perhaps shows that surrealism can be pedagogical, but I think it kind of reveals like a lot of the essentially like pedagogical nature of surrealism itself. Because I mean, a lot of the endless manifestos have sort of this pedagogical quality. So I'm kind of curious, and it's fascinating that I think you said Vučo mainly wrote children's writing was children's literature, which as like a privileged genre for surrealist production. So I was sort of curious in translating this. I mean, was that something did you understand sort of the essence of, or sort of the programmatics of Belgrade surrealism as pedagogical? Is this sort of like a one-off kind of like is an application of surrealist principles to this extraneous genre, or is this kind of like a core? Is this in a certain sense like the essence of surrealist practice?
Yeah,
right, something like this.
I can answer, but if you want to,
You go first. I have some.
Yeah.
Thoughts.
So in the later interview in the 60s, Vučo said how the real surrealists are children. Because they are unrestrained, they are free, they are, they don't question things, they're also curious, or they do question things, they're very curious, and that, at least for him, represented some sort of liberated spirit that we should all tend toward. For Matić, it is definitely in the collage, in the practice, and for both of them, I show you those collages, actually how to dismantle the existing order, and in order to change it, to construct something new. So collage was a form with which you would do that. And there, I mean, mainly there is this moment after Aragon affair in France that becomes big and ripples not only in Yugoslav but also in Czech surrealism. How to position yourself as a surrealist towards real change, revolutionary change? Should we kind of do actively something, or we should just write and through the means of art accomplish that change, social, economic, political? And in Yugoslav case, it was very interesting because they really divided into these two fractions. And I find this book interesting because it kind of puts
brings them
together. Yeah.
No, I would second. I mean, this is something that we see a lot of in the Soviet context. Of course, this idea that the child's view of the world has this liberatory potential, aesthetically speaking. So I think that they were, I mean, and it's not unique to them, right? It's also elsewhere in Europe and here. But I think that, yeah, again, and maybe working on the translation made this particularly clear. This is a sort of strange hybrid, right? And it's kind of a beautiful and perfect hybrid because it brings together those both aesthetic and political strands in their difference. But I think that you do see, I think a lot of the I don't know, grown-up surrealist stuff in the Belgrade tradition, a lot of it is really hard to read. Like
And translate.
yeah, it's hard to translate, but it's also just there is some deliberate obscurity there that I think is entirely in line with surrealist principles as articulated in this one area, whereas Vučo's poem and his other work for children is really written with some kids in mind, right? And I think that there is a little bit of an impossibility of bringing those things together, but maybe it's fine because that was the name of their journal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is in that journal and the other journals called Surrealism Today and Now. The main genre, I would say, that is the most accessible and can respond to your question about pedagogy was the survey. And I think somebody is writing, it's a great topic for dissertation. Survey is a genre in avant-garde art throughout, and it's in Black Mexican avant-garde, for example, in Latin American avant-garde, it's a big genre. So in these surveys, they would have questions circulated among the members. For example, there is a survey about desire, in which participated together Belgrade and the French and Belgian surrealists. And you have this, you have to know languages though, because they printed everything in original. But it's very interesting how they tackle these. So what do you think about education is one of the questions. What do you think about revolution? What is the dream for you? Like all sorts of questions that could provide more of an answer.
And it's pedagogical.
It is pedagogical,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely.
You say a little bit more about how politics comes in after World War II. I mean, in the Czech case, you have all these people who in the 30s are Marxists and Surrealists at the same time, like your folks are. And then after 48 in Czechoslovakia, you're either a Marxist or if you're going to remain a Surrealist, you're underground. How does it go?
I mean, the difference is that Yugoslavia had said no to Stalin, unlike so yeah, these guys are very much in
They become
mainstream.
And they don't have to disavow anything.
No. They actually were the vanguard of the so-called socialist modernism in Yugoslavia that was counter-socialist realism. That was never opposition, or was never banned or never outlawed or
the socialist modernism was not.
Yeah,
it was not.
You do have some other there is kind of underground aesthetic movements of younger figures of stuff who are producing stuff that cannot necessarily be published, starting in like the 60s.
Starting, something like that, who are like Branko Ćosić, he published like 69, 68.
But this generation of the main figures of surrealism became leading.
and they never have to disavow Freud or Breton or anything like that.
No. Actually, Tito was there is a big thing in the 1930s and 40s called Sukob na književnoj levici, the conflict on literary left, between the hardliners, communists, and fellow travelers. And Ristić, Dedinac, even Vučo belonged to these fellow travelers together with Krleža. And Tito, as like secretary of the Communist Party, was criticizing them for not being more opposed to the bourgeois and current
Not being politically radical.
not being politically radical. And after the Second World War, they got the green light, like, okay, you are still like communists all
They're
the
still comrades.
Yeah, comrades, and they, as I showed, they got like very high posts.
Yeah.
And Krleža was even like friend of Tito, and he came up with all this socialist modernism story after on one of the persons who advocated that type of aesthetics.
Well, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
No, really.
Yeah. And thank you, honestly, I think it's a great translation. And really,
No, I mean, I didn't have a chance to read the whole thing, but I read a lot of it last night, of course.
I have a fantasy about another edition that will be less scholarly and less expensive and maybe more of like a children's book.
Yeah.
So-
At least you're in the doctor's
There's
suit.
this, you guys know there's this president, they're in New York, Enchanted Lion, they do all these like socialist, bye bye, thank yous. They did like, they recently republished